I like the story of the second grade religion teacher who was giving a lesson on the 10 Commandments. And she asked the children, what commandment tells us how to relate to our parents? And one of the kids said, honor your father and your mother. And the teacher said, that is correct. Then the teacher said, which commandment tells you how to handle your brothers and sisters? And one of the kids says, thou shalt not kill. Today we have a scholar of the law coming up to our Lord Jesus and asking which one is the greatest of all the commandments. This was a common discussion among the rabbis of the day, because not only did you have the 10 great commandments given by God to Moses on Mount Sinai, but in the book of Leviticus and the Old Testament, there were an additional 613 commandments as well. Laws and regulations, some of them were dietary, some of them were liturgical, having to do with ceremonial hand washings and other things. So it was always a debate, which ones were the greatest, which ones were weightier than others. And so they asked the Lord his opinion to test him. Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest? How does the Lord respond? He responds by taking two laws and joining them together into the one great commandment, which really has two parts, love of God and love of neighbor. First, the Lord quotes Deuteronomy chapter 6. It's called the Shema in Hebrew, which means hear. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind. Then the Lord takes a passage from Leviticus chapter 19 and says, and the second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. It says the whole law and prophets depend on these two commandments. So it's called the greatest commandment, love of God and love of neighbor. And notice that the word love here is agape, which is a Greek word, which is a total, sacrificial, unconditional love. Love is much more than a feeling and an emotion. Love is a decision. Love is an act of the will. Love is desiring the highest and best good of the beloved. So Jesus says, the greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God. And notice he says we have to love God and try to love God with with our whole being, with all of our heart, which means our emotions, our affections, our tenderness, our devotion, and then to love God with all of our strength, which is referring to the body, and love God with all of our soul, which is the will, and to love God with all of our mind. So do we try to do this every day? For example, do we love God with all of our mind? Do we keep reading about God? Because the more we know about God, the more we can love him. Do we read the catechism? Do we read the Bible? Do we read the lives and writings of the saints? Because we want to love God with all of our mind so that we can know more about him. To love him with all of our heart, soul, strength, and mind. In other words, with our whole being. And then to love our neighbor as ourself. And really, Jesus says this summarizes the law and the prophets. It really summarizes the 10 Commandments. The tradition is that when God gave Moses the 2 tablets, the first tablet had the first 3 commandments, which have to do with love of God. And then the next tablet had the next 7, which have to do with love of neighbor. And when we look at those 10 commandments, we see when we follow those commandments, that's how we love God, that's how we love our neighbor. The first 3 commandments is not to have any false gods. And in our society today, there are many people that put wealth, power, possessions, property, honor, fame, fortune as their God. So we're called to love God above all things and not to worship any false gods, to have no idols, but to worship God alone, not wealth, power, property, or possessions. And then the second commandment, do we respect God's holy name? Do we use God's name lightly or carelessly? We should never use God's name lightly or carelessly, but always respect God's holy name. And if you hear somebody use God's name in vain, say a prayer like an Our Father or blessed be the name of God. And then the third commandment, to keep holy the Lord's day. We do this by worshiping God, by coming to Mass faithfully, every weekend, Saturday evening or Sunday, to keep holy the Lord's Day, and to keep Sunday as a day of rest, a day of recreation, a family day, a day in which we avoid unnecessary manual labor. And then the next 7 commandments have to do with how we love our neighbor. First and foremost, beginning with our parents, of showing honor, love, and respect for our parents. If they're deceased, we should pray for our parents and grandparents every day. And then respecting the sanctity of human life. Thou shalt not kill. To always respect human life as precious from the moment of conception until natural death. By the way we live, by the way we vote, to always respect the sanctity of all human life from conception to natural death. Then to respect the sanctity of marriage, and to then respect other people's property and good names and reputation, and not to covet or desire things that don't belong to us. So that's how Jesus summarizes the 10 commandments with the 2 great commandments, love of God and love of neighbor. And a nice way to remember it is to realize that really the first 3 commandments have to do with the vertical, with our love of God, and the other 7 have to do with our love of neighbor, and that is the cross. So when we make the sign of the cross, we should remind ourselves that we're called to love God, but also love our neighbor. When we make the sign of the cross, it can also remind us when we touch our forehead to love God with all of our mind, when we touch our heart to love God with all of our heart and soul, and strength, the shoulders, a symbol of strength, to love God with all of our strength and entire being. Well, how can we love in this divine way? Because to love God and to love others, especially one's neighbor, is not easy. It requires God's grace. Where do we get that grace from? Number 1, through prayer. By praying every day, asking God for the strength to love God and to love our neighbor. For example, when we come to church, that's a beautiful way of showing how we love God. When we go to the parking lot, that's a great way to show how we love our neighbor. So we want to love God, but also to love our neighbor. And where do we get that strength? We get it from prayer and also the sacraments. Receive Jesus in the Eucharist as often as possible. The Eucharist is the source of life. It is Jesus who'll give us the strength to love God, to love our neighbor. And then if we fail, go to confession. Go to regular confession, go to regular communion, and then ask our Blessed Mother for her intercession as well. The Blessed Mother really was the only human person ever to love God with all of our heart, soul, strength, and mind. So ask our Blessed Mother, especially through the daily rosary, for the grace to be able to love God and to love our neighbor. And then lastly, read the lives of the saints. Because when you read about a St. Maximilian Kolbe or a Maria Goretti, you can see that they lived out this gospel of loving God and loving neighbor. And the beautiful quote from St. John of the Cross is, "In the evening of life, we will be judged on how much we have loved."